Let's bring you more on our top story this Newsday now. That we learnt today that the government may be considering changes to its planned media reforms after facing a barrage of criticism over the rush to get the legislation through the Parliament. Two parliamentary committees are being conducted today in Canberra, involving the bosses of the country's largest media organisations. Joining us now is James Paterson. He's the Institute of Public Affairs Director of Communications and Editor of the IPA Review. James, thank you for your time. You've written in an opinion piece that you think the real purpose of these reforms is to try to punish and rein in the government's critics in the media. Which part of this policy in particular do you expect would do that?
Well, there's a couple of really concerning aspects of the bill, Ashley. The first is that the introduction of the public interest media advocate. The public interest media advocate will have two key roles. The first of which is it will oversee media mergers and decide whether or not it is in, quote, the public interest or whether a media merger should go ahead. Now, I don't believe that any single bureaucrat, particularly not one appointed by Stephen Conroy, would be able to determine what the public interest is. I have a view of what the public interest is, you probably have a view of what the public interest is, and Stephen Conroy, I think, has a very different one. So I think it's concerning, first of all, that the government thinks it should be in charge of which media companies can and cannot merge. The second concerning aspect, though, is the introduction of effectively de facto licensing scheme. The public interest media advocate will decide whether current self-regulatory bodies like the Australian Press Council are doing an adequate job regulating the press. And if they decide that they are not doing an adequate job of regulating the press, the members of that self-regulatory body could lose important privileges that allows the media to do their job. For example, exemptions from the Privacy Act. This raises the spectre of the government or a representative of the government in the public interest media advocate being able to silence news outlets that it doesn't like.
Are you encouraged by Julia Gillard's rhetoric slightly shifting today on this, though? She's saying she is open to listening what some of these media bosses are having to say at that Senate hearing we're seeing today in Canberra. And what do you make of what you've heard so far coming out of the mouths of some of those media executives?
I'd say that I was mildly encouraged. Stephen Conroy and the government have engaged in this whole reform process in really bad faith. He stood up a week ago and said this must be passed within the next fortnight, otherwise we won't go ahead. He said they won't countenance any amendments whatsoever. Now Julia Gillard is backtracking on that because of the very well-deserved criticism they've received. I think we've seen across the spectrum within the media real concern about this. We've had people like Kerry Stokes from the 7 Network, who actually stands to benefit in some way from the licence fee reduction proposed in these media reforms, but is so concerned by the attack on freedom of speech and freedom of the press that he's saying that the whole package needs to be reconsidered. But he's also been joined in criticism by Fairfax and News Limited, who've been extremely vocal and in a very important way, in my view.
What's your read of the politics here as to whether or not this is even a chance of getting up within this very short time frame that the government's proposed?
I think this is a real test of the integrity of the independent MPs. They should not allow themselves to be treated like this. Stephen Conroy said that he was refusing to be held hostage by the House of Representatives in the Senate. Well, I hate to break it to Stephen, but that's what the House of Representatives in the Senate are there for. They are there to hold governments to account. They are there to examine their proposals in detail. And they should be given much more than a week to do so. So I think as a matter of principle, the independent MPs should, and I'm encouraged by some of the comments they're making, reject these proposals outright. Now, that's even if the proposals were mundane and uninteresting, but of course these proposals are very dangerous, and so I hope that Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor and Andrew Wilkie and others will be voting against this legislation when it's finally introduced to Parliament.
James Paterson from the Institute of Public Affairs, we appreciate you bringing your views to us on this very controversial issue. Thank you for that. We are going to continue to bring you all sides of the story. This is something, of course, that we've seen a lot of criticism over in recent weeks. We'll continue to bring you the highlights of that Senate hearing continuing in Canberra today. In the meantime, though, let's bring you all of today's sporting news with Paul Gregg, and we've seen some good news for Aussie cricket.
Don't we need it, Ash?